we are back. All right. We've done a long-form version of The Who's bio a couple episodes ago. So I would say if you want to hear us cover the beginnings of The Who, definitely check out that. It's a plug for the earlier episode. I think it's if I do say so myself, I think it's a pretty comprehensive bio that takes you through The Who's early years as well as leading up to The Who Sings My Generation, their first album, which was what we covered. And today we're going to be covering The Who Sell Out, which is their third studio album. In between My Generation, which we covered, and The Who Sell Out, which we're covering today, was an album known as A Quick One. In America, it was known as Happy Jack. And one thing that I think it's important to note about The Who at this time in their career is The Who that I think that most people are aware of, especially our younger listeners, is The Who that is synonymous with big stadium rock, and that is a 70s version of The Who. Slightly before that big 70s rock version of Who was the rock opera era of The Who, which is hard to define as totally just the albums Tommy and Quadrophenia, because Pete Townsend loved his mini rock operas, long-form rock operas, concept albums. It's really, with the exception of My Generation, to some degree, there is either a rock opera or concept album ethos. I know I overused that word, but in this case it really works, on pretty much every studio recording they do, whether it be part of the album or the entirety of the album.
Is that thanks to the Pretty Things and their first rock opera ever?
It could be, but I think it's also just Pete Townsend's personality. I just think he was born to do concept albums. he and the Kinks. It's between him and the Davies, right? That they just, for whatever reason, they felt they were put on this world to do it. And I did read something that was very funny from a review. There's a pretty cool. I'll do another shout out right here. There's a pretty cool blog by a blogger by the name of. I'll give the exact name on Twitter and a shout out, so I don't mean to butcher this, but I believe it's Alt Rock Girl or something similar to that, and she does reviews of classic albums, and she did a pretty hilarious review of The Who Sell Out, but she said that, Pete Townsend is as good as The Who are. He's always at risk of his overindulgences, like expanding beyond what he's capable of doing. So you're always walking the line with The Who on stuff like that. So, but some people love that about them, and you certainly can't fault him for his ambition. But anyway, The Who at this point in time are not quite at rock opera Who yet, but they are toying with the idea of doing a concept album. And this is very much a concept album, albeit it's only 75% a concept album, because the concept is that The Who Sell Out is a tribute to pirate radio, especially British pirate radio, which had recently been banned by Great Britain. And so this is an homage. It was part of mod culture, as well as larger British culture. And
can I jump in here? What do you, when you say pirate radio?
I'm getting there.
Being banned. Okay, all right.
I'm getting there.
I was also wondering that.
So why it was called pirate radio is because they broadcast in maritime waters, ships, and they were radio feeds, and they were not in the country itself. They were off the coast of Great Britain. They also were unlicensed and not held to the standards of traditional radio stations, hence the pirate, right? They're out in the sea and also operating as independent feeds. I don't know how familiar you guys are with that concept in television and cable streams. Every once in a while, you'll hear about a network disruption, right? It's not very common, but in the 70s and 80s, it happened quite a lot. There's a famous thing with like a guy dressed as Max Headroom, right? Comes onto the station in Chicago several different times and sort of commandeers the feed. Pirate radio was not these small broadcast interruptions. It was designed to be radio that exposed you to different types of music. In Great Britain, a lot of it was more American rock and roll music, more blues, more rock and roll, as opposed to the more classic British music, or what was considered to be British music at the time. And because it was unregulated, I wouldn't say everything went, but it was a lot looser, and the BBC in particular wanted to kind of rein in what was being broadcast.
So these are just, so for clarification, so these are just people that are just setting sail and setting up shop to just for what purpose? To get their music out there? Are they making money at all? Like, what is the driving force behind all this effort to get all this music?
It's not universally anything, right? Some of the people they wanted to broadcast the music that they broadcast, right? Some people, they didn't have a platform to do it in traditional media, so they decided to do it, in the same way it's like an underground radio station, right? It's the same basic concept. It's just that when you're out in the international waters, you're not being regulated. And you have to remember the times. In the 60s, the amount of media outlets is next to nothing compared to now. Now, I think you're thinking of it now, Matt, in the modern context, right? Where you can just say, I want to do a podcast, like, say, Combing the Stacks, and you can just do it. Back then, the avenues of how you could have a venue to do it were very limited. So you had to be very dedicated to decide, I want to do a radio station in general, never mind, do it a difficult way. And you also had to be, and imagine this, you had to be a trained broadcaster back then in most cases as well. And you were subject to content standards. So if you wanted to play stuff that wasn't the stuff that was, you hear about Ed Sullivan, right? And how he would edit stuff all the time, right? And the people who kind of buck that trend. But it was the same general idea. Does that make sense?
It's the original podcast that was just on ships, on cruise ships and stuff.
I think that you have a tendency to overgeneralize there, Matt. I don't know if it's the original podcast as much as it's a concept album designed to mimic what it was like to listen to pirate radio.
I'm going with original podcast.
You can own that then, because I'm not going to go with that.
Was pirate radio specifically a British thing, though, or was this all over the world?
It was all over the world, but the idea of being on a ship was a lot more the established British version of it. I think some of it because of geography and just, the
smaller nation.
Smaller nation, exactly.
Gotcha.
Pirate radio in the United States, some of it was this concept, but some of it was also think of it like bootleggers or NASCAR style, like under the radar streams that people were technologically savvy enough to be able to. And some of this you have to understand, and even it's before my time, but in reading up on it, you have to understand there were a whole bunch of feeds that were not utilized in the radio world during that time. So if you could figure out how to jump onto one of those feeds, you could have a pirate radio station. And in the United States in particular, with the expanse of the country, these feeds, you could have multiple different pirate radio stations on different feeds, depending on where you were at in the country. Does that, to some degree, make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's interesting. I had no clue about that, so that's all new.
There you go. So that's what this was designed to do, an ode to pirate radio. It also was sort of a tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement of the fact that The Who were very much pioneers in the ideas of licensing their music and doing commercials and not being afraid to sell their music to make a buck as a side pursuit. So they were very, very, very way ahead of their time in that, since that's become a major media stream for The Who. I can't believe I'm going to do this because it's going to open the door for Matt, but it seems like a long time ago that the idea of the Beatles being upset about instant karma being used in a commercial was like actually a thing that they fought to not have happen, because now the idea that an artist would not monetize through commercials or things like that, or even just using their stuff in movies and TV, is kind of impossible to remember when that was a thing. But
so they didn't. So The Who didn't get any flack for that. They weren't like posers or.
They got flack for it, but they didn't care, as you might imagine with The Who's personality. And they, as they do with a lot of things, they lean into a lot of stuff. And when you look at this, as we talked about with the baked beans, the front cover of this album is Pete Townsend with a gigantic Odorno deodorant bottle and a Heinz baked bean bath for Roger Daltrey. And then on the inside, both Keith Moon and John Entwistle also have parody advertisements as well. And so for about 75% of this album, for those that have not listened, it is an alternation between songs and sort of the equivalent of radio spots that are advertisements. Mm-hmm. And so you're going from one to the other, and it's designed to sound like you're listening to pirate radio. Inexplicably, and there's still not a real answer to this that people know, in the last couple songs, they abandoned that concept that was very easy to understand and see in the early part of the album, and instead do 4 songs in a row that are just songs, and definitely different types of songs than what were covered before. And those songs actually, in some ways, I think, very much give you a feeling for where The Who was going in Tommy and Quadrophenia, because they definitely have that vibe to them, the songs. Maybe not Rael, the last song, which is its own... Well, actually, that does kind of fall in that category.
It kind of is Tommy.
Yeah, I was going to say, it really does. So, yeah, I probably shouldn't say that. It abandons that concept in the last 4 songs. Before you ask, no one really knows why they abandon it, because it is so clearly adhered to early in the album. I think it was an unfinished idea by Pete Townsend. 2 other things to note is that there's a bunch of outtake commercials and songs that they did not release on this album, that both, if you go to Spotify and listen to the extended version of it, you can hear a lot of them, but also there's even stuff that showed up later in compilation albums.
Yeah, there's like a whole other album's worth of material in the bonus stuff. It's like an extra half hour of material.
Well, and you have to understand that the Who were considered at this time a singles band, because they released the album My Generation, but if you remember from our broadcast there, that was basically done because the record company asked them to. They're like, could you cobble together some of these songs and make an album that we can sell? A quick one was done to try to put something together for when they were touring the United States that they could tour behind. And then this was a concept album, but also shared the idea that this was the hope that it would break through in the United States. And it did have a pretty good breakthrough. It did, I Can See for Miles went to number 9 on the charts, which was by far their highest selling charting album. But it was really not until Tommy that they totally broke through in the United States for a number of reasons. And we'll cover that album and talk about it. But The Who at this point were more of a singles band than they were an album band. So this sort of represents in many ways their first attempt at an album that they set out to record as an album. And if you know the singles around this time, it's actually very fascinating, because songs like Pictures of Lily and stuff would absolutely fit on this album, but they were released as singles instead. So I would definitely say, as you listen to this album, the extended version is worth a listen to see what they left out, because some of it's as good as what's on. But also listening to the singles from 1966 and 1967 is interesting, because you can almost make another version of this album, or an expanded version, or replace this track with this track version of it with the singles from the time that very much play into this album. All right, that was a much longer bio than I thought it was going to be. I want to kind of get your views on this album, because this is unlike any other Who album. If you listen to The Who before this and after this, I don't know if there's a complementary album along the way, and there are some very unique things about this album. Let's start with you, Josh. What'd you think of this one?
Yeah, this album caught me off guard, because I was expecting more of that big arena rock Who by this point, because it seemed like after the first album that we discussed, that was kind of the direction they were heading in, and this is almost what I was thinking of was like some of the other albums that we discussed, almost like that Kinks album, in terms of its humor and the I guess this album seems more experimental, and obviously they go the rock opera route, and that's experimental too in a way, but it's definitely not what I expected, bottom line, but the songs are really catchy. I could do without some of the commercials, quote unquote, or radio spots that they insert, but those are also good for a laugh, I would say.
Gotcha. I would say that we don't really get arena rock Who till Who's Next in 1970. Mm-hmm. And the rock albums kind of predate that, if we're kind of going with when does the Who become arena rock Who. Yeah. Now, they did play arenas with those rock albums, but I think the anthemic Who comes later.
Well, I guess my point is that this doesn't even... It's almost more pop than rock in mm-hmm. a way, because as we discussed in that first Who discussion, which was episode 10, by the way, that gives all the bio about the Who, we talked about like the booming drums and like how strong the guitars were, and kind of everything was laid out, and this is kind of a departure in my opinion from.
It's not as heavy. It's right. Not as heavy. I will say the ultimate Keith Moon drum song is "I Can See for Miles." He even plays the hi-hat in that, which is very unlike him. But yeah, if you ever want a song that's like, why is Keith Moon? I'd say there's a couple, but "I Can See for Miles" is probably the clearest example of drums out front. Yeah. Sounds like Who.
That's the only song I knew off this album, actually.
Yep, it's the only formal single. They did release Marianne with the Shaky Hand, which hilariously people did not figure out was about a hand job, but spoiler alert, it's about a hand job.
That's what I thought.
Yep, that's modern context, I guess. But
I thought she just drank too much coffee.
Pete Townshend's writing always covers psychosexual issues, at least a couple songs every album, as do the singles. So that is probably the least surprising thing ever. It's a common trope for him. It's also funny to hear a song written about a tattoo as if it's a scandalous thing, like Tattoo was in the modern context when it's decidedly less controversial. Mm-hmm. Matt, how about you? What do you think?
So somewhat similar reaction to Josh in that I was expecting more of what we heard on the first album. Seeing that this is the third record, knowing that this is before Tommy, and certainly before something like Who's Next, I thought I would hear more of that earlier sound, and I was hearing more of Tommy in here than My Generation. It's interesting and I didn't realize that this is the last formal album that they did before they did Tommy, so I could definitely hear the beginnings of what they would do on Tommy. So it's certainly more varied in its sound. They're certainly getting more experimental. I was hearing different bands in this. I think Armenia City in the Sky, the opening track, it almost sounded like it was like a ripoff of Tomorrow Never Knows. It was a very it's almost like, I think they used two chords in the Armenia City in the Sky, and like Tomorrow Never Knows is one chord, but a lot of the sound effects, like even to the point where they're doing like bird sound effects and backwards
psychedelic almost.
It was very much like that, and I did like it, and I thought also that towards the end, some of those songs that you were talking about, John, that were not really fitting in with the concept as much, I was hearing particularly with Relax and Silas Stingy, I was hearing Syd Barrett, Pink Floyd type, not as heavy in that, but it certainly kind of had that quirky Britishness, psychedelic sound, and I was definitely saying I could totally see Pink Floyd doing something like Silas Stingy sounds like a Pink Floyd song.
Well, that's a John Entwistle song too,
right.
And John Entwistle songs always kind of occupy that same space. From the album previously, there was Boris the Spider was on a quick one, and you kind of can always pick out the John Entwistle song, in tone and sound.
Right. So I thought that was interesting. I agree with Josh and you too, John, that this is certainly not as heavy. The idea of a lot of the Who albums where the bass and the drums are out front, I didn't really hear that a whole lot, but certainly I Can See for Miles is the biggest example of that. And it's also the song I would say is probably most like their first album, what they were doing on their first album, and that's a great song, and it just the drum part is fantastic. But I was the only song I knew as well, but I did like this. The commercials that were kind of interspersed throughout the record didn't really annoy me. They're not very long. You could kind of see, all right, I knew that they were playing off something. I had no idea about the pirate radio thing, so all that information is new to me. So I might go back and just listen to it again under knowing that context now. I don't know if I would say I like this better than My Generation. I probably will say right now I think I liked My Generation more. It's a little bit more familiar. This might be something that will need to grow a little bit more on me for that to happen, but it still overall was very good. I don't think, even with some of the stranger songs, I don't think it was that off base or avant-garde or whatever. I still think it's very melodic, There's some really catchy stuff in there, like Odorono, Tattoo. Those are Marianne with a Shaky Hand. It's all very catchy. And I would agree with Josh. It does seem like more of like a pop record than a rock record. But I could definitely see the seeds being sown for what would become Tommy. And then you've got Rael, which John, I'm sure you can talk about this, but I had no idea that they, what was that? The part in the last track, Rael. It's what was it? Sparks from Tommy.
Yep.
It's basically the same song. So
it is very much, like we talked about that Beach Boys album, Beach Boys Today, where the second half of it was like, this is what's going to be Pet Sounds eventually. I got that same feel.
But it wasn't exactly that, because that part at the very end of Rael is the same song, is that same part of Sparks. So it's almost like maybe they produced it a little bit better with Tommy. But I was interested in the fact that they brought it back for Tommy in the almost exact way that they did it here. Mm-hmm. And I just don't, is there any story behind that? Like what?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. I'm going to guess that when I do the research for Tommy, it might come up, and I'm going to really keep my eye open for that. But in researching this specific album, they did not mention it.
Yeah, it was very noticeable, and they did it. It was a couple minutes, I think, of actually just repeating that. So I thought that was an interesting thing. But overall, I liked it.
I do want to mention a couple things too. Did you guys notice that Roger Daltrey's voice is changing considerably on this album? Maybe it's not as easy to know if you don't know what a quick one sounded like, but Roger Daltrey's going from, I don't want to say crooner, but like blues singer Roger Daltrey into like belting lower register Roger Daltrey here, mixed with like, like that Roger Daltrey that would come later, right? He's not there yet, but you can see that Roger Daltrey starting to happen. And I'll challenge you a little bit, Matt, on the fact that I think John Entwistle on the bass, it's not as out in front like it normally is in most of the songs. It's kind of more a steadying, albeit very present force. But Keith Moon's drumming is still way up front in a lot of albums.
But
and
I feel that I could hear it. I'm not saying it wasn't there and I couldn't notice what he was doing. But it almost seemed like it was a conscious effort not to have it as much in front as they did on their first album.
I agree with that.
I feel like they could have turned it up more, and I felt like with his drumming here, it was more. The mixing was very much. Aside, maybe the vocals were the thing that popped out the most, but I didn't really feel that there was any particular instrument that dominated throughout the album like I felt on with My Generation. And so that's what I was kind of noticing. I'm like, it's definite, to me, it was a definite notice of it getting turned back a little bit, but it's still there. It's still you can still hear it. It's not like it's invisible. And he's a fantastic drummer, but I didn't, with the bass of the drum, that I heard a lot more of, it was much more in the front in that first album. I felt it was set to the back a little bit here.
Gotcha.
I think we are not speaking enough about how funny this album is. I think Tattoo might be the funniest song that we've listened to in all of Combing the Stacks history. And one of the lyrics that I wrote down is, "Welcome to my life, Tattoo. I'm a man now because of you." Mm-hmm. And pretty much that entire song is full of funny lines like that.
It made me wonder if that's why I'm not a man yet, because I don't have a tattoo.
Odorno is pretty freaking fantastic,
John,
too.
I think that's Odorono, John.
Odorono, excuse me.
Odorono.
Sorry, I apologize. Odorono. To finish my thought, though, on that one, it is a hilarious tale of a female lead singer of a band who sees the equivalent of a male groupie on the outside, or a male record producer, I should say, not a groupie, but she's hoping to have the same vibe the groupie would for a male performer. She comes off the stage feeling like she just killed it, and unfortunately her body odor betrays her and chases off the gentleman. And so Pete Townsend, you do see, he is a really, even though he gets a lot of flack for his concept albums not having a lot of concept or cohesion, and certainly these songs, while it's a pirate radio idea, the songs are not tied to any specific, it's almost like you're listening to a radio station. It's just random songs.
Yeah.
And that was what he was going for, too. But Pete Townsend can write a pretty funny song. And no one writes songs that sound lovely but are about dirtier things than Stealth than Pete Townsend does. And they're actually very literal, too, which is always why it's funny, because they're really filthy songs. But unlike certain bands, you just know they're writing filthy stuff. Like Pete Townsend was great at kind of couching it in this other rhythm that didn't let you understand, like Mary with the shaky hands about a hand job, or Odorono is
He makes you think about the filth. Like, he wants you to, it's not going to be out there in front. He's going to make you think about that a little bit. But I also noticed that he sings a lot more here. He takes the lead a lot
in this
more
one.
than
He does,
previous
yes.
album. He's got, I think it's, what is it, 4? I'm looking at maybe 4 songs of the 13. As opposed
I
to
believe
just
you're
one.
right. Yep.
Yeah.
It was a much more. The idea behind it was that the more they all composed and sang, the more the band had versatility in terms of their appeal. That was what they were going for. Now, they abandoned that later because they were like, kind of, why are we doing this when really what we should be doing is having Keith Moon just pound the drums, and Roger Daltrey sort of finds his voice in Tommy a lot, notably, and he becomes definitively the guy who's going to sing the Who's material. But yeah, at this point, Roger Daltrey's the lead singer, but he's not like the only singer. And you're right, Matt. This one is, you get a lot more Pete Townsend singing.
John, do you like this? What are your thoughts on it?
I do. It's not my favorite Who album, and it's as I was telling Josh before the pod, it's the Who album I probably come back to the least. Doesn't mean I like it the least, but it's very much a specific listen. And as you mentioned, there aren't a lot of singles on this, so it's not like an album you come to hear the singles. There's also a ton of singles around this album that are wonderful singles. Substitute, Pictures of Lily, like I mentioned earlier, Magic Bus, that are songs I really like, but that weren't on albums. And so you can listen to the Who of this album with songs that you would recognize from compilations as well. And that's what's fascinating about the Who in these early albums is you have... who I'd compare it to, Matt, is the Smiths. That they have all these albums, but then they can release like 20-song albums of all their B-sides that sounds like it should have been an album on their own. And many of the most famous Smith songs are songs that are B-sides that were never on an album.
Same thing with the Beatles.
Yes, but no. I think most of the Beatles stuff...
No,
no Beatles. No Beatles talk.
Past
We got
Masters,
9 albums of theirs.
They're Past Masters Volume 1 and 2. Tons of stuff that were huge hits that weren't on albums. It's
yes.
True.
I think as varied as this album is, and kind of there's little different things in each song. I'm surprised that they thought this would be a breakthrough album for the States, because it doesn't seem really like everything we've said. It's kind of a tangent or an experiment that they tried and then went a different direction ultimately.
But if you think of it without the ads, I think it becomes easier to understand why they were thinking of it that way. Because if you listen to them as radio tracks, you start to see how you could play it on radio and it would make sense.
Yeah.
I want to mention 2 more things, though, and I don't want to go long because I do want to save times for the other stuff. One is, at around this time, the Who were having some of their most notable performances. They had a pretty infamous performance at the Fillmore in San Francisco, where they normally only played 40-minute shows, and the Fillmore had a rule about how long you could go, so they had to go longer. And as they went longer, they ended up turning that into a mini opera that became the second half of a quick one, an album that we won't cover. But basically, by doing that, they ended up making an album. Sort of on, I won't say on the fly because they had the material, but they were like, hey, that could make a good album. They also followed that up shortly afterwards in June of 1967 by playing the Monterey International Pop Festival, and they very well-known story where they and Jimi Hendrix made a bet to see who could end their set more outrageously. Hendrix had a very famous performance and won the bet, but the Who destroyed their instruments, and it was also around this time that Keith Moon put actual dynamite, not at this performance, but at another one, actual dynamite in his drum set and blew it out, which actually led to hearing damage for Pete Townsend later in his life, that he credits to that exact concept, but he actually also greatly appreciated it. But that was kind of who the Who were. They're blowing up toilets, putting dynamite in their kit, trying to out crazy Hendrix, destroying their instruments. So we're at that version of the Who right now.
So
the
did
Wild
they,
Man
when
Who.
they had that bet with Hendrix, did they just concede? All right, you lit your guitar on fire, you win, or did they?
I think
have
it's
a third party be the arbiter for that.
I think it's more history has been the arbiter that Jimi
Yeah.
Hendrix won that specific one. But if we're going with the totality of crazy performances, I don't think anybody was beating the Who in this era. That was kind of their shtick.
Yeah, you certainly remember Hendrix setting that on fire, but the Who were. You see the picture, the footage of them destroying their instruments
Yeah.
and just going nuts. That's
Yep.
crazy. Like
Yeah,
that,
It
Townsend
is-
destroys the guitar in that clip.
Yep.
Oh, everything,
If you get a chance, watch both of those performances at the Monterey International Pop Festival because they're great slices of 60s rock in general. They kind of give you an idea of who the Who were at this stage and sort of in general. And also, it's one of Hendrix's seminal moments. I think probably right up there with him playing. The only other one I can think of is him playing the national anthem, right? Those are the two that people think of.
Yeah.
Yep. So those are good ones. And
I would
the
say.
second.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
And I was going to say the second thing is that it took the Who forever to record I Can See for Miles, and they consider it probably their hardest song to make. And it makes sense because if you listen to that, like Roger Daltrey's just belting, Keith Moon is going absolutely ape shit. It's one of Townsend's best guitar parts, and John Entwistle is firing away too. So they actually had to record it in 3 different studios in 2 different continents, and they kept messing around with the sound, and it was so difficult to play after a while and so hard to get the sound that it was actually the only song they would not play live. And which probably was a little bit of a problem for them because it was also their first top 10 hit in America and reached number 2 in England. And so, when you're struggling to play that song and that's your call, imagine, going to see a band and, you know them from that one song and some other stuff and then they just don't play that song. But, that was, I thought, another interesting anecdote. But I think this is definitely worth a listen. The Who are never boring. The cool thing about The Who is that everybody has a favorite different period of The Who. This might not be my favorite album of The Who, but there's plenty of gems on it. And as Josh mentioned, the songs are very funny when you listen to the lyrics. If you're not a person who picks them up as you're listening, just take a look at them as a comparison piece. I think you'll be highly amused. And this is definitely one of the few albums we've covered where listening to the extended version of it, I think, is actually instructive because there's some interesting stuff. I also would say if you're following along with us and you liked The Who Sing My Generation and you like The Who Sell Out, then you should absolutely be combing the stacks to find their singles from about 1965 to 1968 because there's a lot of gold in that pot.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. Looking at this now, I just looked at a quick one, the track listing there. The only song I know off of that is Boris the Spider, and the only song I knew off of this was I Can See for Miles. So in their first 3 albums, it is interesting that these are not their singles are definitely noticeably missing.
Yeah, they were all over the charts in Great Britain too, but it's just all of their B-sides. And that's what I was saying when I was challenging you on the Beatles. It isn't that the Beatles didn't have that, but the Beatles were also churning singles off of the albums they were releasing, right?
Yeah,
the
they were
Who
doing
were
both,
not
yes.
the Who were not doing that. The Who were releasing their singles as singles, and that was what was charting, and then they were releasing these albums that were sort of the only thing I could really compare it to is, the Grateful Dead sort of made albums just to make them, but it was really about going to see them live, and so the albums were sort of secondary, right, in some ways. Like Fish even more so, I think, than the Grateful Dead. That's not what the Who were doing, but the Who were making these albums clearly to try to do a different thing than they were trying to do with the singles. And then it sort of all came together for them on Tommy, where they were able to get singles while doing their artsy, pieces. And really, we can't say enough about. We talked in the first album we covered about the Who being forerunners on the punk and different music like that. This is a forerunner for art rock, without a doubt. This is a forerunner for art rock and concept rock. So,
John, do you know who Speedy Keen is? The guy that wrote Armonia City in the Sky. That seems like an interesting. Who he? Who is he? Because everybody else is like it's Entwistle writing or it's Townsend, and then you just have this guy Speedy Keen who wrote this song. I guess.
So he was a keyboard player. He was in a group called Thunderclap Newman, and he was a friend of the band's. And how he met Pete Townsend. Sorry, I'm doing this all off the top of my head from remembrance, but if I remember correctly, he was a roommate and worked as Pete Townshend's driver, if I remember correctly. And at some point, because he had a musical background, he wrote Armenia City in the Sky, and they just decided that they wanted to include it. And so he basically gave it to The Who after they played it. Yeah, and so he was just a musician who was a roommate and odd jobs type guy for Pete Townsend. And he eventually, if I remember correctly, became a session musician. For a lot of people, we would know of nothing like The Who, though. I want to say like he was even on like Kenny G or something, like as a keyboard player, and some other folks. But yeah, he was just a friend of the band who wrote the song.
Huh. That's a good song.
He also, I believe he also produced a Motorhead album, if I remember correctly. I'm going to definitely clean the stacks next week with Speedy Keen, so I apologize.
Kenny G, The Who, and Motorhead. That's quite the resume.
Yes. I promise you now, listeners, I will come back with all the Speedy Keen information you've ever read. And what a name, by the way,
Yeah,
Speedy
it's a great
Keen,
name.
isn't it? Like, it is a fantastic friend of the band name. So, yep.
Yeah, there's lots of good names in the 60s, for sure.
You got it. Well, I think that'll put a bow on this segment. I would say it sounds like all of us are saying worth a listen,
Yes.
if I'm summarizing.
Yeah,
I agree.
definitely for me.